Thank you, Brian. I'm going to try standing down here a little more tonight so I feel a little more part of the whole thing. Up there, it seems so far removed. But hey, it's been fun to associate with you guys and go on for a little walk today and share meals together. So I appreciate being here and having the opportunity to share with you guys. I want to start with a question up there. Can Christians believe in an ice age? And I'm going to give you three choices or three answers. One is yes, one is no, and one is I don't know. So I want to show of hands. How many believe that Christians can believe in an ice age? Okay. How many say no? Maybe a couple. How many really don't know? Yeah, there's a few. Well, hopefully we will be able to answer some questions about the ice age for you. Sometimes when we think about the ice age, we get all romantic feelings with cute little woolly mammoths holding trunks. But really, was there an ice age? And was there many ice ages or just one? And does the history of the Bible allow us to believe in an ice age? Well, I hope to answer these questions and more. But what comes to mind when you think of an ice age? Do you think of the earth completely covered with ice? Anybody think that? Yeah, I mean, some have probably entertained that idea, and that's called snowball Earth. And there were scientists 100 years ago that believed in snowball Earth. But they believe it happened before the Cambrian explosion. And those of you that aren't really into this sort of information probably never heard of the Cambrian explosion. But the Cambrian explosion occurred at the lowest layers in the Earth's sedimentary layers where we find fossils. In other words, that's where we find the first fossils, and maybe I should back up here. Every major life form is found in the Cambrian layer. And that's kind of difficult for the evolutionists to explain because they want things in progression from simple organisms to more and more complex. But in the Cambrian, in other words, the lowest layer, you find all the different forms of life in that first layer. So it's called the Cambrian explosion. Well, obviously, if you had snowball Earth, you couldn't have life. So they say, yeah, it happened before the Cambrian explosion, before there was life on Earth. Well, when we think of an ice age, we think of glaciers. And today, some of us at least, went out to the overlook and we saw where the Purcell lobe of the glacier came down and blocked the Clark Fork River Valley and caused an ice dam. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the future. But scientists now agree, well, I should back up and say that currently 10% of the Earth's land mass is covered by ice. 10%. At the peak of the ice age, they now estimate that 32% was covered by ice. So there really wasn't a snowball Earth. In fact, if there was a snowball Earth, they can't conceive of a way to get out of that kind of scenario because so much energy would be reflected off the snow or ice back into space, we'd never warm up. So at the peak of the ice age, about 32% of the land mass is covered by ice. Currently, the glacier ice contains 75% of the fresh water on Earth. That's a sizable amount. If all that ice melted all around the world, if all that ice melted, our sea level would rise about 230 feet. Well, if it did do that, what would happen to the state of Florida? it had just about disappeared. I mean, the highest part of Florida in the Panhandle is just barely over 300 feet. So Florida would disappear. If you've been to California, Central California would be a huge inland lake. It'd be full of water. Los Angeles would be gone. That whole area would be underwater. So 230 feet does major changes to our geography. Now, some of the explanation I will do for the Ice Age, I have to confess, was because my stepdad doesn't believe in the Ice Age. So I try to show him evidence, and he doesn't really believe in an Ice Age. And so you're going to get a little more evidence than maybe you really need. But let's talk about some of the evidence for ice ages. This is a glacier. We're kind of getting an aerial view of this glacier that came down. And you notice the upside down mushroom area? That's called a terminal moraine. In other words, it's a bunch of rock and sand material that was moved by the glacier, and then the glacier receded. To learn some things about glaciers and the moraines, I put this picture in there, but I apologize. I took it off the internet. If I'd have created it, I would have made larger font so you could actually read it. And you're a long ways from that screen. So let's zoom in a little bit, and you'll notice there's a dark line. It's actually kind of brown in the middle of that glacier. That's called a medial moraine. If you look above that, between the glacier and the little ridge, that's called a lateral moraine. And out in front, there's two arcing dark brown areas, and those are terminal moraines. So what happens is a glacier grabs rock and sand and mud, not really mud, but what could become mud, in the glacier, and then if the glacier recedes, then it leaves that ridge, and those are called moraines. And we see that here is a real glacier, and that dark area out in front is the terminal moraine. Now, is there other evidence of glaciers? Well, there is indeed. This is bedrock that has been scratched by the rocks embedded in the ice. And as the ice slowly moves along, these rocks are digging scratches or grooves in that bedrock. Now, I don't know if you've been to Victoria, BC, but this is the Parliament building in Victoria, BC, and I was actually there this July and was able to take this picture. But what's intriguing to me is right close to this is some bedrock that's been scratched. If you were to turn right, if you were looking at this building like I am, and you turn right and walk to the next intersection, across the street is bedrock that has been scratched. And here it is. If you've been there, it's in the same area that you would board the carriages to take these rides around through town. So here is bedrock that has been scratched by glacier. This is the same rock taken from a different angle. So right there in town is evidence of a glacier. And in fact, they believe that the entire Puget Sound was one massive glacier. You know, all around Seattle down to Olympia, all that water was all covered up with glacier at one time. Now, there's other evidence of glaciers. This is on Steens Mountain. If you were here last night, you saw the many trips that I have gone on and places that I've learned from, and this is one of them. I took a trip to Steens Mountain. Does anyone know where that is? A couple of people maybe. It's in southeast Oregon, a pretty desolate place. In fact, to the east of this mountain is the Alford Desert, and it gets essentially no rain. It's a real desert out there. But this is Steens Mountain, and you notice the U shape of this kind of valley. Now I'm standing, well, I didn't take this picture, but I took similar ones. And if you stand at the top of the mountain and you look down these valleys, this is what it looks like. Now you notice the general U shape of that valley. If you see a valley that's U-shaped like that, it was carved by a glacier. Even if there's no glacier there today, it has been carved by a glacier. Now, if a canyon is carved by water, it doesn't make a U shape. It makes a V shape. Now, this particular notch in a basalt ridge is roughly 45 miles west of John Day, Oregon, near Dayville, Oregon. And the John Day River will pass through this notch, and this notch is called Picture Gorge. Now, it seemed like Friday night I mentioned something about a pictograph that was a rake symbol, and that meant the 7 days of the week, or 7 days tied together made it a week, and that's what sparked my wife's interest in possibly this would be a thing to pursue and share and that sort of thing. Well, it's in Picture Gorge that pictograph is depicted. And that's why it's called Picture Gorge, because there's a bunch of pictographs. Now, just for a side information, petroglyphs are scratched or chipped. In other words, the rock is defaced. Pictographs are where they paint the rock. Typically, they used iron oxides and urine, and they made this paint-like substance and would paint the pictures. And in Picture Gorge, they're painted. So this is an example of where water cut through this notch. And this is actually a water gap, because there's an easier way for the water to get around, but instead of going around, it carved the path right through this spot, making a V notch. So let's go back, and you can kind of see now the U shape of this valley carved out by a glacier. Now, again, we don't have sound, so I can't tell you what this guy, I can't let you hear what this guy says, but he is pointing out evidence of glacier. It's called glacier till. Now, if you have water that sorts rock and sand and a variety of sizes, you will get sorting. Similar sizes will stay together, and you'll get layering, whether it's done by wind or water. You'll get some layering effect. But when a glacier moves material, it's all mixed together. It doesn't get sorted. And then he moves to what's called an erratic. That big rock that he's standing by is an erratic. In other words, this glacier brought this big rock. And down around the Willamette Valley, there are erratics that icebergs carried there. So in glacier material, we have till, we have erratics, we have U-shaped valleys, and we have moraines. Now, if we want to know where there was ice or glacier ice, we look for that kind of evidence, and we know that there were glaciers there. So now that we know that, let's look at a map that shows areas that were glaciated. Now, this particular map shows in white the areas of the world that were glaciated, and obviously the brown or reddish-brown areas were not. Now, if you can see that world map, there might be some curious things that you start to wonder about. Look at Alaska. You would think that during an ice age, Alaska would be completely glaciated. It wasn't. The lowlands of Alaska were never glaciated. And if you look at Siberia on the right side there, there's major portions of Siberia that were never glaciated. Now, I'll talk in a couple of minutes about scientists running information through computers and lowering the temperature of the Earth, and when they do that, it doesn't match the evidence. And the evidence shows that the lowlands of Alaska were never glaciated and major portions of Siberia were never glaciated. And that just doesn't compute. But in a few minutes, I think it'll become more clear why that might be the case. Now, this is Glacier Bay in Alaska. And if you notice the glacier moving into the bay, down at the bottom of the glacier, you notice that it's kind of dirty. And all that material that's mixed in with the ice will become glacier till, or end moraines, lateral moraines, that sort of thing. So after I've shared this information with you, what is the recipe for a glacier? What causes a glacier? Any brave soul? Snow! It takes a lot of snow to make a glacier. Without snow, there's no glacier. Well, just how much snow does it take? Well, it depends on the moisture content of the snow. Here in Idaho, and I've never been here when it snowed, but my guess is a good share of the time when you get snow, it's pretty dry. Is that true here? Sometimes it's wet, and sometimes it's drier. Well, if there's a lot of moisture content in the snow, it may take 10 feet of snow to make 1 foot of ice. But some snow is so dry, it may take as much as 100 feet of snow to make 1 foot of ice. So you got the picture. Anyway, you look at it, it takes quite a bit of snow to make ice. Well, if ice is going to accumulate, in other words, if the snow comes and it starts to make a glacier, but then it warms up during the summer and melts it all away, are you ever going to have a glacier? No. So, in order to have glaciers, you have to have snow that at least some of it doesn't melt all summer long. And then you can add more snow the next winter and more snow the next winter, and it starts to stack up and it stays permanently. Summer or winter, you have a glacier. So if you think about the global warming alarmists, and their evidence is that glaciers are shrinking, it doesn't necessarily mean things are warming up. It just means we're not getting the snow, enough snow, so that it doesn't melt all summer long. So keep that in mind as well. Okay, now let's do a demo. You know what? I forgot to turn this on. I missed my cue. So we're gonna turn this thing on, and if the kids want to come up and stand to the sides, you can see what the components of this thing is. If you want to stay there, you can, but if you want to get a closer look, the kids can come up. Just don't stand right in front so your moms and dads can see too. So what do we have here? Yeah, you can stand behind it. We have a teapot. We have a hot plate. Now this is an induction hot plate. I don't know if you know what that is, but it only works with metallic or iron metallic pots. I haven't tried this one. My mother loaned this because remember, I'm living in a travel trailer and our stuff is all packed. And honestly, when Brian and I talked about me coming, I said, well, late September, maybe early October. I wanted to get here before it snowed, but yet I wanted to give enough time for our house to be done so we could move in. Well, did you need me?
Yes. Keep hitting it.
Okay. So my stuff is packed, and we don't have access to it. So my mother loaned me a hot plate and a teapot, and I got this pot, borrowed it from Crystal. And inside this pot, can one of the kids tell everybody what's in there?
Ice.
Ice. Yeah, there's some ice in there. And so what do you think's in here? Yep, there's some water in there. So what happens when you put water in a teapot on a hot plate? It boils, good. So what do you think's going to happen?
It's going to melt the ice.
You think it's going to steam and melt the ice? Yeah, probably is. Well, you guys watch it, and when it steams, starts steaming, you let me know, okay? And I'll talk to your moms and dads. Because I forgot to turn this on to begin with. So if we look at the screen up there, we will see what's called the water cycle. The water cycle exists where water evaporates off the ocean and it goes up into the atmosphere and it's transported over the land. And then what happens, kids? Do you know? It rains. Anything else? It snows or hails. In other words, that water comes down on our land. And then what happens to it? When it rains, where does it go? When it rains, the water comes down. Where does the rain go? In the ground? Is that the only place? In lakes and rivers and streams. And then what happens to it? It goes into the ocean. And what do we call that? The water cycle. This is a smart gal down here. So that is the water cycle. And, oh, I wish this was going so I could keep going. But what's going to happen, I hope, let's see if it's getting hot. Yeah, I think so. It'll start here pretty quick. But this is really key. And when I did this for the first time at my church, I told them they were guinea pigs and I needed to practice this deal. And we did have a lot of hang-ups technology-wise. Things didn't work. Something overheated and it wouldn't advance. And, we had all kinds of trouble. But we did this, and there was a gentleman in our church that owns an electrical company. He has electricians and they do wiring, mainly commercial wiring. And out of all the stuff I shared, he liked this the best. It made sense to him. So hopefully we'll get it to work. So it's the water cycle. Let's see what else I can share with you. With a cold earth, you get less evaporation off the ocean. Less evaporation means less precipitation. Less rain and snow means less vegetation and fewer animals. But for our topic, you get a reduction in glacier formation if you cool the earth. So, if we cool the earth and we plug in the information into a computer, we cool the earth, say, by 2 degrees. Are we still on? Yeah, I think so. So if we cool the earth by 2 degrees, then what happens? There's less evaporation, there's less precipitation, there's less snow. Now, it's true, with a cooler earth, our summers would be shorter and maybe a little cooler, 2 degrees cooler. And that might allow the ice or the snow to stay a little longer. But even if you cool the earth by multiple degrees, maybe 10 degrees, which is drastic. I mean, when these climatologists and these global warming people are talking about cooling temperatures, they're talking maybe 0.2 of a degree. Well, if you lowered the Earth's temperature 10 degrees and you really made it cooler, there's even less evaporation, less precipitation, less snow, and you don't get the buildup that creates a situation like we have right out here, the plaque we talked about today. Oh, is it starting to steam? It's steaming. Good deal. So now what's going to happen? Are we going to melt all the ice? Now, why do you think Brian put that styrofoam cup there? Does it look like it's melting, Cora? Kind of? What does the bottom of the pan look like? So look on the bottom of the pan. What's it look like? Yep, condensation. What's condensation? That's a big word.
Moisture.
It's moisture. In other words, the steam is going up. It's hitting that cold pan because there's ice in it. And if we wait long enough, it might even drip. Is it dripping? Well, put it where the drips are coming down. Oh, well, is it really that far back? Well, you guys watch it and adjust the cup depending on where the drips are. I think that'll probably be good enough. So the question is, does cooling the earth put us in an ice age? Well, it does make a cooler earth, but the evidence doesn't bear up the same information. So just cooling the earth isn't the answer. So let's look at this cycle again. What is the driving force of this cycle? The sun. The sun provides the energy that warms up the oceans, makes the evaporation happen, and when there's changes or differences in temperatures, then you get wind that carries that moisture over land masses. Now, the land masses, at least some areas, are cooler. Now, this is kind of a stepped up situation. In other words, I put ice in this pan because it makes it happen faster. But if the moisture goes up to cool atmosphere, especially into the mountains, then it comes down as precipitation. It condenses out. So the dilemma is, how do we get an ice age? Because if we warm up the earth to get more evaporation, to get more precipitation, we have longer summers, less chance for the ice to stay all summer long. So warming up the earth doesn't produce an ice age either. So cooling the earth doesn't produce an ice age. Warming the earth doesn't produce an ice age. So how do we get an ice age? Well, let's see if we have an answer. In Genesis 7, so you guys see it dripping? Hey? You want to catch all of it? Well, you know what? I think we've probably seen it demonstrated enough, so you know what's happening. The steam comes up, the steam cools down because it hits the pan, and it condenses back to rain or water, so it drips in the cup. So do you have any questions about that? If not, you can go back to your seats and I'll shut this thing off. So Genesis 7, starting in verse 11, it says, "In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the deep, or the great deep, were broken up, and the windows of heaven were open." The majority of the floodwaters came from under the crust of the earth, and they were hot. How hot? Well, we can kind of guess because they have done some boreholes. One was done in Russia, and I know there was one done in the United States. The Russian borehole got the furthest down. I believe about 7.5 miles. They bored a hole down into the crust of the earth. And they used to think, I think it was around 4 miles down, that there was a change in rock, because when they did sounding, they could tell there was a change in rock, and they thought it might go from granite to basalt or something like that. But when they bored down, they didn't see that change. But what they did find was water and pulverized rock. Huh? How do you explain that? See, the pressures down that deep are so significant that no surface water can penetrate down through the cracks in the Earth's crust. The pressures are so great, there's no cracks. But when they bored down, they found water. It was highly mineralized water. Now, from a creationist perspective, we would say, well, of course, that's residual that didn't come all the way to the surface during the flood process. So, when they bored down, their equipment failed because it was too hot down there. Their drill bits would start to melt. Because of the friction and because of the heat, the combination, it was just too much for the materials of their drill bits, and they had to quit. So they measured the temperatures down there, and it ranged from 350 to 500 degrees. So if you could kind of average and say, well, the water that came out from under the crust of the earth at the time of the flood was probably around 400 degrees. Well, that's hot. And then you have other things that cause heat. Let's see, I talk about those things. Another thing that is close to you guys, if you go back into Washington State and you travel around Washington State where these coulees have been carved out, you'll see layers of basalt. Now, there's evidence, substantial evidence, actually good evidence, that these layers of basalt were laid down in a water environment. So, from a creationist perspective, we believe that there was probably about 2,000 feet deep water in at least Oregon and Washington, and cracks. You remember we talked about the plates kind of colliding and buckling up, and there was Rocky Mountains coming up and other ridges coming up. We talked about that on Friday night. Well, along with that process, there were cracks that developed in the crust of the earth, and the molten lava from below came up through those cracks and flowed towards the Pacific Ocean. And layer upon layer upon layer of this basalt was laid down. One of you, I think, talked to me briefly about the cave at Blue Lake that's the Rhino Cave. If you haven't heard about it, you can look it up on the internet. They found this cave that was in the shape of a rhinoceros, kind of upside down. It was bloated because it had been in a state of decay. When the lava flowed around it and left a space, when the animal decayed, rotted away, and disintegrated, the lava was already set up. So this cave is in the shape of a rhinoceros here in North America. And closer to where I live, there's several places where you can go and see castings of stumps and logs where the lava flowed around them, and then the logs have long gone disintegrated, but their casing is left. So you have layer upon layer of basalt that was laid down under a couple of thousand feet of water, so it heated up the water without instantly turning it to steam. Because at normal atmospheric pressure today, what does water boil at? 212, in here a little less, because you have a little bit of elevation. Well, if you try to boil water under 2,000 feet of water, it's going to have to heat up a lot more because the pressures are a lot greater. So basically, you have lava flowing under the water, adding to the heat. And this happened in many places around the world. So you have hot water coming up, you have other mechanisms, volcanoes going off, you have the sea floor opening up, and that exposure to the hot rock Bottom line is, at the end of the flood process, the water was hot worldwide. Let's see if I got ahead of myself. Yeah, I probably did. I get so enthusiastic about sharing information, I forget where I am in my notes. But I'm glad you guys are accepting me despite my faults. But if you think about it then, the oceans were warm at the end of the flood process. In fact, Michael Ord, who lives in Montana, studied the Ice Age for 40 years plus, says that he believes that the Arctic Ocean, way up north, was warm enough to go swimming in. He thinks more than 80 degrees at the end of the flood. And worldwide, the average temperature was at least 80 degrees in our oceans. So we have part of the answer to the dilemma that the scientists have. Because the scientists said if there wasn't so much evidence for the Ice Age, it would be science fiction. Because they don't know how it could happen. All their computer models don't jive with the evidence, and they just try to cool the earth, and it doesn't work out. But we as Bible-believing Christians, we have the answer. Because part of the recipe is hot oceans. What's the other part of the recipe? What if God gave you all authority, all power, how would you create an ice age? Anyone brave enough to make a guess? Exactly. We have warm oceans. Now we've got to cool the earth. Why are we going to cool the earth? Well, if you have tremendous evaporation, you're going to have tremendous cloud cover over much of the earth. With cloud cover, you reflect a lot of that solar energy back into space. At the time of the flood, we have volcanic activity that's hard to comprehend. With the shifting plates on the Earth's crust, there's volcanoes, thousands of volcanoes going off multiple places around the Earth. So if you have all that ash dumped in the atmosphere, you have cloud cover, there's a major portion of the energy from the sun that's being reflected back out into space. So with the water cycle, the driving force is the sun. For the Ice Age, the driving force is hot oceans. We don't need the sun. The oceans are giving off their energy in the form of evaporation. You have that moving over land masses that are relatively cool. Now, not everywhere do they produce ice, but many places there was a lot of snow. In fact, during the peak of the Ice Age, some places here in North America, it was one storm after another. Snow, snow, snow. Month after month through the summer, it didn't matter. And that's how you can get massive ice accumulation. No, the scientists, even the secular scientists, believe that right here north of us in Canada, the glacier ice was at minimum 5,000 feet deep. Now that represents a lot of snow. But some scientists believe that it was as much as 10,000 feet deep. 10,000 feet deep of glacier ice? That's a horrendous amount of snow that has to fall. And their models, computer models, just by cooling the earth, absolutely don't even come close to explaining that. But now you have the answer. So what does it take to make an ice age? Warm oceans and cool land masses. And the only explanation for that is Noah's flood. Now, would you have guessed that? That's pretty incredible. Well, the Ice Age, when I understood the Ice Age, it really opened up a lot of ability to understand things that were a puzzle to me. And here are some questions. Why did people tend to be nomadic hunter-gatherers? You know, you learn that in school, that early man was nomadic and hunter-gatherers. They didn't plant vineyards and gardens. They went like with the herds and that sort of thing. The Ice Age answers that. Why were so many people cave dwellers? How did people migrate around the world? You ever wonder how people migrated? You know, if we believe that the ark came to rest near Mount Ararat and then the people spread out from there, well, how did they get everywhere? And why is there evidence of life in the Sahara Desert? Maybe you didn't even know that. But the Sahara Desert, the largest dry desert, has evidence of life. Why would that be? And then what about structures found underwater off the coast of Pakistan, India, Japan, Europe, and others? We've heard of the city of Atlantis. Well, let's take a look at some of these. Why about hunter-gatherers? Well, during the Ice Age, the weather was rather unstable. With drastic changes and ice accumulation, the weather patterns were not entirely constant. Weather is complex, and you have something happening here that impacts here, but this impacts here, and that impacts over there, and so you get changes in weather patterns. So people tended to migrate. I mean, if one area is getting a lot of rain for 2 or 3 years, and you think you can really grow something, and then the weather pattern changes and you don't get any rain, what are you going to do? Well, people tended to pack up and move because it's easier than investing a lot of time and energy and irrigation and other ways to combat the problems of weather changes. So I believe that is one of the main reasons why we have people that were hunter-gatherers. They didn't settle down in one spot because it wasn't worth the energy. Why were people cave dwellers? You know, the secular schools try to teach us that early man were cave dwellers. Why were they cave dwellers? Because they were stupid enough that they didn't know how to build a house? I don't think so. They were cave dwellers because the weather conditions sometimes were so harsh, especially close to the ice, that it was much safer to be inside of a cave than dealing with the major weather that was happening outside the cave. So we find evidence of cave dwellers, but you know, these weren't dumb people. Now, I searched on the internet and found this picture, and this is supposed to be in a cave in France, done by cave dwellers. Now, I don't know, honestly, looking at that, it looks too good. You know, most of the pictures look more like this one. But the cave dwellers, they buried their dead, they had musical instruments, they used tools, and they had amazing art. Does that sound like dumb people to you? Not to me. Well, let's look at another question. How did people migrate around the world? How did they get from the Near East or Asia? How did they get to the South America? Well, let's look at this map. I know it's kind of hard to see, so just get a kind of a lay of the land. You can see the United States there and Alaska. Let's zoom in a little bit. Notice this is supposed to have occurred during part of the Ice Age, and that there was a pathway through Siberia, through Alaska, into North America that wasn't glaciated for a while. This allowed people to migrate, animals to migrate, all the way to South America. But it didn't last forever. As the Ice Age progressed, then it tended to look more like this map. But the interesting thing was the lowlands of Alaska and some of Siberia wasn't glaciated. And they're way up north. You would think that way up north it would be glaciated. But it wasn't. And part of the reason for that is the Arctic Ocean. The Arctic Ocean up there is a deep basin. Where's Brian? Oh, back there. Brian and I looked on Google Earth, and if you move your cursor around on Google Earth, not Google Maps, but if Google Earth, you can see the altitude either above sea level or below sea level. And the Arctic Ocean is this huge basin, 12,000 feet deep. Now, if you have a huge basin of hot water up there, it's going to affect the environment around that area. So for years, the lowlands of Alaska were warmed not by sunshine, but by the hot water. And as the glaciers developed down as far as Indiana and Ohio, way up in Alaska, there was no glaciers. So the animals progressed and moved further and further north to get away from the ice buildup that was occurring further south. Now that is a rough concept for us to understand because it just doesn't seem right, because way up north it ought to be colder. But for years after the flood, it was warmer, allowing these animals to exist up there. But as the Ice Age came to an end, weather patterns changed, that big basin of hot water cooled down, because if you have a big basin of water, and let's say it's all the same temperature, but the environment cools it down, where does the cold water go? Down to the bottom. And the hot water stays up above. But as more of it cools, the line between cold water and hot water continues to rise. Now the surface is still warm, still impacting the environment, but finally all the water is cold. So suddenly it's not warming up that area anymore. The weather patterns change, and you have animals that get caught up there in Alaska, and they eventually freeze because the weather patterns trapped them. It caught them up there, and the temperature, once you cool the surface temperature, the temperatures can drop dramatically, 40 degrees in an hour. I mean, it's incredible. So that's important for us to know, to answer some other questions. But for those that didn't get to go on our little excursion today, I wanted to show you this map. This is basically what we saw on a placard out there, and it shows the Cordilleran ice sheet, and the lobe that is closest to us is the Purcell Trench, or the Purcell lobe, that came down and blocked the Clark Fork River Valley and stopped up what has become known as Lake Missoula. Now, Lake Missoula, for those that didn't hear my little spiel earlier today, Lake Missoula, the volume is compared to Lake Erie and Lake Ontario combined. Massive amount of water. And the ice dam, they estimate, was between 3,500 and 5,000 feet deep of ice, holding back, at the maximum, holding back about 2,000 feet deep of water. I mean, it's hard to comprehend. And then you have, I believe, at the end of the Ice Age, ultimately there was catastrophic failure of that ice dam that allowed that water to come rushing out of there and cause all kinds of damage, help carve out Lake Pend Oreille. And in fact, probably most of you know that Lake Pend Oreille is used for submarine training because it is so deep. It's the fifth deepest lake in the United States, at a little over 1,000 feet deep. And the carving action of the water coming out of there deepened this gouge in the earth and taking material with it. And if you want to know more about that, we can answer questions later. But I want to move on. What about evidence of life in the Sahara? Now, the Sahara is a forbidden place. I'm not sure what this guy is doing laying there on the top of a sand dune, but this is in the Sahara Desert. There really isn't much there today. But there are signs of life. There's pictographs and petroglyphs of life. These are domesticated animals and people there in the Sahara Desert. And if we were to look carefully at satellite views of the Sahara Desert, there's river valleys, there's lake basins, drainages. So at one time, the Sahara Desert got rain. And here's an aerial view of the Sahara Desert. See how massive it is? There's two deserts that are larger than the Sahara, but they're frozen deserts. They're not dry deserts. But this is the largest dry desert. And notice the little yellow arrow pointing to the Nile River Delta, where the Hebrews lived for some time. So what about man-made structures underwater along the coast? Well, let's think about this. If you have massive ice buildup on the continents, what's going to happen to the ocean levels? The ocean level is going to go down. In fact, depending on what part of the globe you're talking about, the ocean levels dropped from 200 to 400 feet. And in my thinking, when I first heard that, I thought, well, how can that be? I mean, how can you have a variation? Well, in areas like just north of us, where you have this massive ice buildup, all that weight is pushing down on the Earth's mantle. So when it melts, the Earth kind of recoils and comes up along with the rising water. So in areas where there was a lot of snow or ice buildup, then the difference in the level of, or sea level, wasn't as great as, say, further south near the equator, where the differences were more like 400 feet. Well, if you think about it, if the flood triggered the ice age, and actually without the flood there is no ice age, and people started finding places on the earth to live, obviously they would stay a lot of times near the coastlines, because further inland was cold and sometimes harsh, and maybe even glaciers, depending on what part of the world you're talking about. So they tended to stay along the coastlines where it was warm, temperate, no matter where you went on Earth, because of the warm oceans. So they built cities and communities, but when the Ice Age came to an end, and it came to an end fairly quickly, at least within a few years, they didn't have a chance to combat the rising sea levels, so they just moved further inland, uphill in a sense, and rebuilt. But now we find the evidences of their original places. I mean, there's man-made structures off the coastlines in many places around the world that's in 50 to 250 feet of water. Now, we've heard of the city of Atlantis, and we think, oh, that's a mystical city, and maybe some of the information surrounding it is, but it's real, because there really was cities that are now underwater. They've disappeared because the water level rose rather abruptly. Here are some columns, man-made columns that are underwater, but you know, man-made structures aren't the only evidence that the sea level has risen. If you look at this map, you will see in red it says underwater forest location. During the Ice Age, Florida was bigger. The coastline was further out to sea, and that allowed things to grow. So we have cypress forests off the coastline near the Gulf Coast that divers like to go and investigate because they're kind of intriguing. Here's a stump of a cypress tree, and the fish get to use it as a home. So here are some Bible-related questions. In fact, let's not read all these. We'll just kind of go through some. Why was Job so rich with animals if he lived in a desert? Have you ever tried to figure out where Job lived? The land of Uz? Well, where's that? Well, let's take a look. Let's look at Job 1. It says, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil. And 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. Also, his possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large household, so that this man was the greatest of all people in the East. Well, if you do search and you find the land of Uz, it's in a stark desert. People don't live there today. Well, is the Bible incorrect? Is the Bible a myth? Are these just stories that try to motivate us to do things and they really aren't true? No. The answer is the Ice Age. Because during the Ice Age, I haven't gone, honestly, because I'm living in a travel trailer and I've had so much work in the house, I haven't been able to review and go through my program, so I don't have it entirely memorized. So I apologize for that, but it's good information anyway. So why is Israel more like a desert if the Bible says it was a land flowing with milk and honey? Have you ever wondered that? That troubled me. I mean, when I'd see pictures of Israel, it's not completely a desert, but it's not a land flowing with milk and honey. Because that was the Bible's description of a very lush environment. And then if Canaan was well watered, why did they need wells? Why did they need to later dig wells? In Genesis 13:8, it says, so Abram said to Lot, please let there be no strife between you and me, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take the left, then I will go to the right. Or if you go to the right, then I will go to the left. It was a lush land, but not quite enough for all their flocks and herds. So they split up. And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. Now that was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the Garden of Eden, like the land of Egypt as you go towards Zoar. Okay, well, if we go to this place, this is thought by some to be the rock that God caused water to flow for the children of Israel when they camped at Mount Sinai. Now, does that look like a lush place? It's the land of Uz. It's the same area that Job lived. Well, how can that be? How can he have thousands of animals if it looked like that? Well, God took the people out of Egypt and they went to the same area. Notice the red area there is Mount Horeb, is the same region of Uz. And in fact, if we look at this rock, this is in the same area where the rock that the water came from, there's petroglyphs of ox and sheep on this rock. They're kind of stylized, drawn in more of a square fashion instead of real. Now, I believe, I can't really prove it, but it seems to fit the Bible sequence that the Ice Age was coming to an end at the time of Joseph. There was 7 years of plenty. They got more rain. They could grow more stuff for 7 years because there was a shift. Because there's one area, like way up north, we talked about the Arctic Ocean, when it cooled down, there was a major shift in the weather patterns. Well, as areas were impacted like this around the globe, there was major shifts in weather patterns. And so you might have even more rain coming to Egypt than it had before. But that was followed by a period of 7 years of famine. 7 years of famine. Now, it says in Genesis 41, then the 7 years of plenty which were in the land of Egypt ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come as Joseph had said. The famine was in all lands, but in the land of Egypt there was bread. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Then Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, do. The famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, and the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So all the countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine was severe in all lands. Does that sound like a little spot? This impacted a wide area. A wide area. So, if we look at history, Joseph's rise to power was about 1700 BC. And the best estimate is that the flood was about 2300 BC, or a difference of 550 years from the time of the flood to the time of Joseph, roughly 550 years. Now, again, Mike Ord, who is probably the leading Christian expert on the Ice Age, Mike Ord, with all his calculations and estimations, said that the Ice Age lasted between 400 and 700 years. You know, he's not going to narrow it down to exact, but somewhere between 400 and 700 years after the flood, the Ice Age came to an end. Well, that fits right in. 550 years is when Joseph was dealing with these 7 years of famine. You know, let me back up, because I may not have completely helped you understand. They have taken the information that they believe existed right after the flood, you know, with the warm oceans and all the variables, and they fed that into some of these supercomputers with programs to predict weather patterns. And, you know, I realize that we kind of poo-poo that because the weathermen aren't always correct. You know, maybe 2 or 3 days out, they're pretty close. But they use computer modeling and these programs to predict what's going to happen. Well, they took the same information that creationists expected after the flood, and they plugged it into these computers. And what they noted for this particular area of the world is that these huge supercanes, not just hurricanes, but supercanes developed on the Indian Ocean, came across the Arabian Peninsula and just hammered them with rain. And the residual affected Palestine or Canaan and the land of Uz. So during the Ice Age, this region of the world, including the Sahara Desert, was well watered. We can trust the Bible. When it says that the land of Canaan was flowing with milk and honey, it was because of the Ice Age. But that did come to an end. There was changes in weather patterns, and people had to move away because it just wasn't conducive for living in some of those areas anymore. You know, there's other topics that we could cover, like woolly mammoths. And if you really want to know about woolly mammoths, Mike Ord writes a couple of great books that help explain their fate and how that happened. Another one is the Red Record. The Red Record is the oldest history of North American natives, and it maps their history from Asia coming across the land bridge in Alaska during the Ice Age when the water levels were down. They were able to walk, and they went across into Alaska and down. They crossed the Rocky Mountains, and they noticed something. even in their record, they noted that the large game animals were moving north where there was less cold. Imagine that. And then it maps their voyage across the Mississippi, and they finally settled in Pennsylvania area and split off in different groups. There's a book that's translated into English from their pictographs that you might find on the internet. I have somebody in my church that was inspired after I shared that information, and she went to the internet and paid $95 for a paperback book that's falling apart called The Red Record. They're not always that expensive. If you hit it just right, you might find somebody to sell you one for a lot less. Giant camels and sloths in North America. Did you know that? In Oregon, there's a place called Fossil Lake. And in the early 1900s, people were able to go out there and collect fossils of giant camels, horses, sloths, animals that just don't exist here anymore. And we talked earlier about dinosaurs. Well, one of the dinosaurs, the flying ones, is we'll call the pterodactyl. The Native Americans called them thunderbirds. And I even went in Southern Oregon, I went to a playa lake, or a dry lake bed, and looked at pictographs, or petroglyphs in this case, and I found the petroglyph of a thunderbird that this lake was named after. It's Thunderbird Lake, but it isn't a lake. It's just like a dry lake bed. The Indians, or the Native Americans, saw during the Ice Age some pterodactyls that they called thunderbirds. Now, not everybody thinks that, but the evidence seems to suggest that is the case. And I coined the term, not that anybody's using it, but I indicate that Nevada was the land of lakes. If you've ever traveled through Nevada, there's dry lake bed after dry lake bed, and it's kind of interesting. Well, those were lakes. During the Ice Age, those were a bunch of lakes, because there are areas like Southern Oregon that's a desert now, and Nevada that's a desert. During the Ice Age, they were getting water. In fact, if you've gone to, what is it called, Mesa Verde, where the cliff dwellers are down in Colorado, they're mystified as to what happened to those people. It's like they suddenly decided to leave, and they don't know why. I believe it was the end of the Ice Age. They didn't get the rain that they were used to, and they had to find other places to live. So the Ice Age, in my view, helps explain a lot of things, including the Missoula flood. But I hope the information I've shared with you helps you realize that you can really trust the Bible. When it says stuff, it is accurate. And if science hasn't caught up, that's their problem. And if we have a question about something, we investigate and ask for God's inspiration until we have an answer. So let's bow our heads for prayer. Dear Lord, we thank you for helping us understand your mysteries. Thank you for helping us understand that we can trust your Bible, your word. We ask that you'd take us from this place with a better understanding that we can share and motivate others to see that you are our God, our Creator, and our Savior. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, if you guys are not too tired and you want to take a few questions, I can't promise answers, but if you have a question, yeah?
When the oceans were hot, where did the fish go?
That's a good question. And what she asked is, when the oceans were hot, where did the fish go? Because, today there's fish that can only survive in cold water. How could they survive if the water was too hot? Well, my explanation is that not all areas were too hot for life. There probably were some pockets of ocean water that weren't quite as warm, but it's certainly warmer than the cold water fish could really survive in. But God has built into the genetics of animals the ability to adapt. Now, we as Bible-believing Christians believe that there was only one pair of bears on the ark. And all the other bears came from that. Now, do polar bears eat bamboo? No, it doesn't even grow in their environment. But panda bears like bamboo. Well, how did we progress to have all these kind of different bears that like these different environments? Well, built in the genetic code is the adaptation or the ability to change and adapt to their environment. There's people, I guess, that are working at breeding polar bears and grizzly bears, and they will breed together because they're bears. So I believe that God did build genetics into animals to be able to adapt and survive some warm water, and later they changed to adapt to a different environment, and now they're cold water only. Does that help? Any other questions back there? Divided. You know, there's a lot of people that have different interpretations of that. I personally believe that meant that that's when the Tower of Babel was struck and the people were divided. They split up and went to different parts of the earth. And that happened about 100 years, roughly 100 years after the flood. Now, with 100 years of the Ice Age in progress, the ocean levels had dropped some, not totally as far as they were going to go, but the ocean levels had dropped, and that allowed dispersion of people to different parts of the world because they were able to walk. They didn't have to even build boats. So I believe that that's what the Bible is saying when the earth was divided. There's some that say, well, that's when the flood happened. Well, that doesn't really fit. Any others? Yes.
So can you explain when Noah was waiting for vegetation to come back up and sent the dove and found the olive tree? How does that explain that there was the ice everywhere?
The ice wasn't everywhere. You know, the ice, the ice didn't initially impact the area where the ark came to rest. It was further north, and that was a short amount of time, so that huge accumulations of ice hadn't occurred within those few months. But the weather patterns were set in place to start building up massive amounts of snow and ice. So when the bird or the dove went out and found an olive branch or an olive leaf, it was some residual vegetation that hadn't been totally obliterated by the flood and was starting to take root and starting to grow and, you know, sprouting buds, and the bird found it. Does that help? No. Yes, yeah, everything was uprooted. But part of the understanding that some Christian scientists have is that there were huge vegetation mats. In other words, a lot of the vegetation got buried. That's why we have coal today, massive amounts of coal. So some of the vegetation didn't get completely buried, and it was floating in these huge vegetation mats on the surface of the water. So when the flood waters receded, some of these mats got caught on the land to help reseed it and to help the growth and spread of vegetation. So it wasn't all completely obliterated. Otherwise, we wouldn't have any growth. Yeah. And there was probably some critters that weren't air breathing. Maybe some of the insects and whatnot also survived in some of these vegetation mats. Nobody can prove it, but that's what creation scientists believe happened. Yes, sir.
The ice age occurred after Noah's situation. And you said people wandered about like nomads. There's evidence showing that he was actually husband and raised animals for location right there where the ark rested.
That is true.
If that's true, then there must have been a pocket of time that there's still a substantial amount of vegetation around, the ground soil to be able to raise enough cattle.
Right in that spot.
Yeah.
Yep.
Because he wasn't a nomad, he stayed in that one location, built fences, did all sorts of things in that area. But now today it's very extremely cold and very desolate. So he must have a pocket.
For a period of time, he was able to do that. And not everybody was nomadic. I mean, there was people that went further towards the equator and the conditions weren't as harsh and they were able to do some farming and establish themselves. There's pockets of evidence of that. But a lot of people were nomadic. And my emphasis was people were nomadic because of the weather conditions, not because we were progressing from lower life forms like we're taught in school. Yeah. Any others? I know it's getting kind of late. Oh, you have a question?
I've heard, but I don't know if it's true, that when the atmospheric pressure changed and the oxygen density changed before flood and after flood, it affected some of the animals, the snakes, the insects, to produce venom after the flood because of the
Pressure change. Did you hear her? Yeah, there's some people that believe that like rattlesnakes weren't venomous in the pre-flood world because of the atmospheric pressure caused changes. Honestly, I don't have enough information. I haven't been exposed to enough information to give me an opinion either way. But why is rattlesnake venom poisonous? It is a pre-digestion. In other words, when a rattlesnake bites you, it's poisonous to you because it's starting to digest your tissue, break it down, and it isn't that it attacks your nervous system or knocks out your brain and kills you. When a rattlesnake bites you, it's digesting the tissue and it causes major swelling. And if you get to the point where it's causing that reaction, they often do a fasciotomy where they slice your skin to allow the fluid to escape so it doesn't do further damage. So a rattlesnake's venom is just pre-digestion. So when it catches an animal, the venom is kind of pre-digesting that mouse or whatever it's. So I don't know that I would entirely buy the fact that before the flood they weren't venomous. Yeah, but I don't have enough information to give you a definite answer. Yes, sir? Did you hear that question? There's some that believe that prior to the flood, there was a canopy or a shell around the earth, and that provided pressure to condense the atmosphere, and that accounts for why we probably had about 2 to 2.5 times the amount of atmospheric pressure. And how do we know that prior to the flood there was greater atmospheric pressure? One of the pieces of evidence is the bubbles that were captured in tree resin or sap that was petrified, and then they can analyze those little bubbles. Outside of that, I'm not sure what the evidence is, but the question remains, was there a canopy, and during the flood, did it collapse? And I have to say, I don't know. I read a book called The Waters Above. I don't know if you've seen that book, but The Waters Above, I bought it hoping to have the answer. And it goes through all the historic evidence that there was some sort of a canopy above the earth. And it goes through a bunch of formulas, but it never does bring you to a conclusion whether there was or there wasn't. But the current laws of physics don't allow for a hard shell canopy to exist. Now, remember, when we're dealing with the Ice Age, it wasn't a global cooling. It was hot oceans and cold land masses. That's the recipe for an Ice Age. It isn't just global cooling. So, when it comes to a canopy, I just don't know. Because they tell me the current laws of physics will not allow us to have a hard shell canopy out there. Not only that, but you'd have a tough time seeing the stars. You could see stars straight overhead for a short arc, but if you get closer to the horizon, you wouldn't be able to see the stars because the light would be refracted and you wouldn't be able to see those. So, there's enough questions. If that's of interest, maybe you can dig up some information and do some searching and ask for God's guidance, and maybe you'll come up with the answer, but I haven't.